Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Delighted to have Maritza, Joia, Rob, and Sherri here for the Romantic Manifesto with Ayn Rand. This time we're talking about bootleg Romanticism. We did not decide who's going to go first. The Tracinskis are the bookends. So which one would?
I was going to lobby for this time having us go third and fourth.
You want to go third and fourth? Okay, who wants to go first?
Joia, would you like the honor?
You can go.
Oh, okay. Well, all right. I guess I'll go first. Well, in that case, I'm going to start with giving you a definition of bootleg. That would be anything cheap, second rate, or cheesy, regardless of whether it is stolen or copied. So when we look at it from that perspective, it doesn't really paint the most flattering perspective of when Ayn Rand is saying bootleg romanticism, right? But what I believe she's saying with this chapter mostly is she's, again, this entire book is a plea towards giving ourselves and our future more hope than it has currently. So in this chapter, she says, the people's need for a ray of romantic light is enormous and tragically eager. And so basically what she's telling us is we as human beings have this need, this internal, unavoidable need for more than what we're currently finding today. And she goes into it to talk about bootleg romanticism as this is what happens when we kind of half-ass, apologies. When you kind of not all in do something, if you do this with a half measure, the end result is still not as satisfying as our soul needs. So I think we've mentioned before here in previous weeks that Ayn Rand is she's of the Aristotelian perspective, and so Aristotle, I'm going to quote him for just a minute here, and he said that fiction is of greater philosophical importance than history, because history represents things only as they are, while fiction represents them as they might be and ought to be. And in the interview, Ayn Rand she uses this quote and she says, if you wish for a key to my literary methods and for novels, this is it. And she holds this up as this is my vision for romanticism. Anything less is not good enough. So when she uses the word bootleg, she uses it as not good enough. And so because next chapter, we're going to be talking about, moral treason, as it were, she's looking in this chapter, she's looking at those works which are striving in some small way to fit the ideals of romanticism without acknowledging or accepting that that's what they're doing, or by trying to seek forgiveness for doing so. And that's what bothers her. And that's what she sees as, this is a problem. She, in the beginning of this chapter, she tells us that we have oh crap, I just lost my train of thought, apologies. And she states that so if you want to look at the climate of your current day society, look at their art. She says, if something is a dominant voice within a certain given period, then it tells us something about the state of people's souls. I mean, the state of people's souls is what she's saying is at risk here. So by not stretching our artistic muscles and by not including things that shine a light on our morals and our values and our principles, we're putting the very soul of an entire society at jeopardy. And she goes one step further in this chapter to say, doing a half measure, half-hearted nod to this concept is not good enough. The end result still leaves you wanting. Because if you create a work of art that seems to allude to this ideal standard or to give us hope, but then you denigrate it by saying, I didn't really mean it that way. Well, then in that case, you're taking it away. Any hope that we could have obtained from that work of art is removed by the refusal of the artists to acknowledge that such was their, not, well, I don't know if I want to say such was their intent, but that there was a value that could be found in that work of art. And I think that I'm gonna stop it there and let other people go on.
Thanks, Maritza. Next up is Joia. Joia, go ahead.
Thank you, Maritza. That sets up perfectly for what I wanted to talk about too, because I also went to look into the etymology of bootleg for this chapter and looking at it. And the thing I learned was that the phrase even comes from smuggling. So apparently back in the day, smugglers would wear these really tall boots that would come up over their legs. And that's how they would smuggle in their illicit and illegal goods in the legs of their boots. And so what does it mean then to say that Romanticism is somehow bootlegged? And Maritza was talking about the next chapter, and the way I read it, this chapter, it is in the perfect spot because I see that it definitely follows from the chapter we just read, which was the aesthetic vacuum of our age. And it's going to lead into the next chapter, which is all about art and moral treason, which is the title in this book. And it comes out of a longer lecture Ayn Rand did that was called Art and Education. So to connect it with the chapter we just read, we had a really interesting conversation, I thought, last week, talking about what is the aesthetic status of our age. So Ayn Rand identified in the early 60s and probably late 50s when she started working on this, that there was what she identified as an aesthetic vacuum. That at the time, the art of the day, serious art, was naturalism and or modernism. And so Romanticism didn't really have a place. And so in this chapter here, I think she's suggesting that in that culture, that any aspects of Romanticism essentially had to be smuggled in. And as Maritza was suggesting, you could only sort of have Romanticism if it were tongue-in-cheek. You couldn't approach Romanticism in a serious way in this time when Ayn Rand was writing. But so one of the questions I think we'll want to ask is, does that actually still hold up for our time? Last week, we were talking about how we live in, I would argue, a very different age. With the internet, that there's just a wide range of all different kinds of artwork. And perhaps the struggle is more finding the signal within the noise amongst everything that is available and that the internet makes possible for us to see and read and experience. So I think that's just even one interesting question that we'll want to ask about, like, does Romanticism have to be bootlegged into our own artistic culture in the 2020s? And it's interesting to me that the specific concrete example, or one of the main specific concrete examples she talks about in this chapter is James Bond, both the books and the movies. And at the time when she was writing this, she talks about the first 3 James Bond movies and making an argument that the creators of those movies had this tongue-in-cheek attitude toward James Bond. But of course, now we're living in an era when there have been decades of James Bond films and the franchise has just become monumental. And so perhaps we even want to ask questions about, how does a James Bond film operate today and in our culture? And there is something that she brings up that I think is interesting. And it's the question that I wanted to ask. So she has this phrase here where she's talking about specifically James Bond and the genre of thrillers that James Bond would represent. She says, nobody takes thrillers literally, nor cares about their specific events, nor harbors any frustrated desire to become a secret agent or a private eye. Thrillers are taken symbolically. They dramatize one of man's widest and most crucial abstractions, the abstraction of moral conflict. What people seek in thrillers is the spectacle of man's efficacy, of his ability to fight for his values and to achieve them. What they see is a condensed, simplified pattern, reduced to its essentials, a man fighting for a vital goal, overcoming one obstacle after another, facing terrible dangers and risks, persisting through an excruciating struggle, and winning. Far from suggesting an easy or unrealistic view of life, a thriller suggests the necessity of a difficult struggle. If the hero is, quote, larger than life, so are the villains and the dangers. And then later on, she has, a couple pages later, a sentence I find really interesting. She says, inspired by James Bond, a man may find the courage to rebel against the impositions of his in-laws, or to ask for a deserved raise, or to change his job, or to propose to the girl he loves, or to embark on the career he wants, or to defy the whole world for the sake of his new invention. And in my notes, I have to admit, I just wrote here, really? Because in my experience of in the 2020s, or even just say the 2000s, the most recent era of our Bond films, it's not my sense of what people get from the Bond franchise or from thrillers, the genre as a whole, or from action films, we might say. We all know now that the popular catchphrase that James Bond is the man that every man wants to be and every woman wants. But when I ask myself, to what extent is that true? Just even watching this film with other people, going to see it in the theaters, do people walk away from a James Bond film and feel inspired to pursue these abstract moral conflicts in their life? It's interesting to me because my analysis of how James Bond is in the culture, and I'll be really curious to hear other people's impressions of how people react to James Bond. But my sense is that for most people, James Bond is a kind of escapism in a very concrete kind of way. And I want to say, I don't even think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. As human beings, we are both abstract and concrete. But my sense is that when people today even admire James Bond, they like that he has all the fancy gadgets and that Sean Connery had sex appeal even up to practically his dying day not that long ago, that he's cool with his martinis and his fancy gadgets and his ability to fight all the car crashes and the fist fights and go after the villains. And that part of even the appeal of the action film franchise is seeing it in the big theater. There's just something about the sensory experience of watching a James Bond film on the big screen that I think a lot of people do gravitate toward that escapism. They wish that they had the sex appeal and the money and that they either had the pretty girl on their arm or the handsome guy, that's part of the appeal. But then I think this is starting to make Ayn Rand's point, which is that we are missing the real value of Romanticism, the connection of the abstraction, the grand sweeping moral conflict that really is important with all of the glamorous concretes. And I think that's going to take us into the next chapter when we think about what art can offer us and perhaps what we're still missing in art of the 2020s. But I'm really curious to hear what both everyone on the panel thinks and the audience as well.
Wonderful. So Rob or Sherri?
I'm going to go first. I had some stuff planned, but you derailed me with all the Bond stuff. So so being a little older, and basically I've been around for more of the James Bond franchise, and I have been in the key target demographic of the James Bond franchise for roughly 40 years. So let me give a little history on that, which I think is actually ties into this in a very interesting way, which is that Ayn Rand, basically her commentary on the James Bond movies goes through the first two films. Sorry, there's like 20 of them now. What happened after that is that the idea of the James Bond film as a parody, as it being this sort of over the top and unrealistic thing, that got worse and worse as time went on. And my sense of it is that what sort of the the bottoming out of the James Bond franchise was the later Roger Moore years, where he was a little too old to really carry it off that convincingly, and it got kind of smarmy.
It's 24.
24. Okay, I thought
24.
it was in that neighborhood. It got kind of smarmy and cheesy, and this is the 70s, right? So everything was smarmy and cheesy because it was the 70s. And they sort of had the same thing happen to James Bond that happened to Batman, right? So Adam West made Batman campy and cheesy, and the old TV Batman show is bootleg romanticism completely. They take the comic book superhero and they do it as a joke, right, to undermine it, while still having all the appeal of the heroism, but then also having it undermined by being a campy joke. And the Batman and James Bond franchise basically did the exact same thing to deal with that problem. And that is that they went dark. So in the late 80s, and again, target demographic here, right? So I'm a teenage guy in the late 80s when Frank Miller comes out with The Dark Knight. And this is the guy who turned, who gave us the dark, gritty, brooding Batman that we have today. Right? Batman is the essence of Romanticism in the 19th century, sort of brooding, Byronic sense of Romanticism. And so the idea is that you have to make him dark and morally ambiguous and morally conflicted, and had that gritty element to him. And they did this by contrasting the Superman. Superman is the guy who fights for truth, justice, and the American way. He's the idealist, and Batman is the sort of down and the anti-hero. They tried to turn him into an anti-hero, which I think is a concept she's going to mention later. And they did the same thing with Bond, and it's a little bit more of a delay. They tried various other people, but basically the last 10 years or so with who's the guy they have doing it now? The name's
Daniel Craig.
Daniel Craig,
Thank
that's
you.
right. With Daniel Craig is the gritty, conflicted James Bond, right? He's the dark James Bond. And I have a big problem with that. I actually stopped watching the movies because the first Daniel Craig movie he was great in it. But after that, he just doesn't look like he's having any fun, right? And James Bond's supposed to be fun. He's supposed to be having fun. He's supposed to have this, this lifestyle that every guy would wish he had, right? And he looks like he's miserable the whole time. He has this sort of pinched look on his face in every scene. And so they've taken it and they've gone dark. And that's kind of been the way of bootleggering Romanticism in the current environment, is to do the dark version of the hero. So even, for example, Star Trek, right? The reboots of the Star Trek series that they've done, the Star Trek movies they've done recently. The second installment of that was called Star Trek Into Darkness. And it was the same thing. We're going to go dark and gritty with Star Trek, which was famously very sort of optimistic view of and non-morally conflicted view of the future, right? So that's sort of been one of the ways that we've been bootlegging Romanticism in the current era, is by saying, let's take the hero. First we made fun of the hero, and then we made fun of the hero so much that he seemed cheesy and smarmy and nobody wanted to take it seriously. So now let's make him serious again by making him dark and morally conflicted and ambiguous and making him into an anti-hero. So beat some of the romanticism out of it while still keeping enough elements to keep the audience coming into the theaters. Now, that's one version of it. Now, we do have a lot of stuff that's I wouldn't exactly call bootleg romanticism. This is what I wanted to talk about, which is, I think, the main strain today. This chapter, by the way, in bootleg romanticism, I think is the one that is much more closer than the previous chapter, closest to describing where we are now, right? The current state of the culture. And that is that there's a lot of stuff you can find out there that is romantic in the sense that she's talking about, but in the specific kinds of, that tends to be concentrated in specific kinds of genres. There are always exceptions, but the general trend is that it tends to be concentrated in certain genres. So the key dividing line for me is a movie called The Princess Bride. Now, show of hands, who's seen The Princess Bride?
Even Shrikant has seen that one.
Even Shrikant has seen this one. All right, it's a 1987 film. And if you've seen The Princess Bride, and I ask you, is it a parody of a fairy tale, or is it just a fairy tale?
Yes.
And the answer is yes. It's kind of both. It's a parody of a fairy tale, of a sort of, and a fairy tale, I mean sort of the Sir Walter Scott, Ivanhoe sort of medieval adventure film or story. very similar to Sir Walter Scott, who she mentions in this chapter. So it's this sort of medieval knights and ladies kind of setting, and it's sort of a parody of that, but it's a parody so affectionate of its subject matter that it sort of becomes sincere by the time the film is over, and it really is like it's crossing that dividing line. And I think that sort of set a new trend. This is in the 80s that happened, and it set a new trend that I think today can be seen in the fact there's plenty of romanticism on screen, so long as it's in the Marvel comic universe, right? So you can go see these vast multi-film epics, basically, of comic book superheroes in battles of good versus evil. And the universe thing is kind of an interesting thing because there's a commercial imperative behind this that I've looked at, which is that part of the reason for having a universe, everybody has a universe now, right? There's the Marvel universe, there's the Harry Potter universe, which they call the Potterverse. There's all these literary universes. And part of that is there's a commercial incentive for it because, if you set something in the real world, right? The universe that's right out there when you open your door and walk out into the street. If you set it in the real world, anybody can set something in the real world. But if you set it in a literary universe where something's different, where it's a comic book universe or a Harry Potter universe, everything's copyrightable, right? And so you can have a franchise where only you get to produce these things, and you get people coming back to see the latest installment of this thing. And so there's a commercial imperative for it. But behind that, I think the cultural imperative is specifically the fact that these stories are not set in this universe. And it's the idea that you can have all the romanticism you like, as long as it is unrealistic and to some extent unserious. And that's why a lot of this stuff comes from comic books or from the Harry Potter novels, which were written for an audience of 11-year-olds, where it has to be juvenile and unserious and unrealistic, and therefore not to be taken seriously as high art. And that's the last thing I wanted to mention. I'm going to make it a little shorter because I talked about James Bond earlier, but the thing that I think the price we pay for that, as I see it, is the death of the highbrow. Now, I came across a statistic a while back about how in the 1950s, when they had the Metropolitan Opera had broadcasts on the radio, they would regularly get audiences of 10 or 15 million people. And this is, the population of the country, of the United States, was not as big then as it is now. It's significantly smaller. And they get these enormous audiences for the Metropolitan Opera. Now, some of that you couldn't get that today. Now, part of the reason is because, of course, there's so much recorded music, there's so many other options you have. But the other thing is that, when we go to the opera, what we notice is, we're not exactly what I call young anymore, and we're generally the youngest people, among the youngest people there.
Usually by 20 years.
Yeah, and they have the buses outside with the from the retirement homes, busing in the 70 and 80-year-olds. It's a very geriatric audience, and it's not reaching the young audience. So I think what's happened is because all the energy and creativity and appeal of Romanticism went into sort of the low end, the pop culture end of the market, and produced such a tremendous outburst of creativity in terms of storytelling, in terms of set design, in terms of special effects, and all that sort of thing. Tremendous outbursts of creativity and a lot of appeal, especially to young people. But because it's all gone out there into the pop culture level, it has basically starved the highbrow level. And the highbrow level has shrunk and sort of disappeared. And it's partly because, of course, on the highbrow level, they're not allowed to have, as a general rule, you're not allowed to have all the things that are appealing and exciting about Romanticism. So I think that in addition, that the thing I take away from this is that what's happened really since Ayn Rand wrote that is the consequence of bootleg Romanticism has been the sort of dying away of highbrow culture and the takeover of the culture by pop culture. And so I would say Romanticism is flourishing, but under a glass ceiling, is the way I would put it.
You done?
Yeah.
So that's a good stepping off point for my what I wanted to talk about. I'm going to show some images and some videos in a video or two in just a second. But what I wanted to tie back to, Rob's here talking about the highbrow. the elite. We talked about this last week about how in art there's probably more than these three, but three main places for art to flourish. One is in a niche market, which the wider the internet expands across the world, the more strength that niche market has. Then you have the popular culture, and then the highbrow, or I don't know, you want to call it elite, whichever is culturally acceptable. But it's at that elite level that in the 60s, and probably a little earlier than that, when abstract expressionism became sort of the way, the accepted way of doing art. You had, at the early levels, people like Picasso, the early abstract expressionists had the training that used to come, you know, through art ateliers. You were learning all the abilities to create art that reflected realism. But after several generations of abstract expressionism, that type of skill, while you did some of it in art schools, it wasn't the focus, and it certainly frowned upon at some periods of that time to be doing such a thing in an art school. You were frowned on for sure. But that's where the niche markets came in play. And last week I pointed you all to the Art Renewal Center, where if you look through there in education, there is page upon page of art schools all around the world that are focusing on realism and in their art curriculum. So that's part of the problem, is that when you're trying to get realism and romanticism back into the highbrow, you have two problems. One is the gatekeepers don't let you because it doesn't fit with their sense of life. And the other is that the loss of skill. But we've been having a resurgence of the skill over the last several decades, where you really can go to an art school and really seriously have probably one of the best training that you could get, because they now are taking what was learned by all of the old masters is now the starting point. You know what I mean? It's not like, well, that's where I hope to get. You actually, that's probably year two. You know what I mean? So there's so much more to go, but there's still that issue of, does it fit in the highbrow sense of life for romanticism? And what I wanted to show is what's happening now. I'm going to show some sculptures this time. We've been showing a lot of paintings, so I thought let's put some sculptures in. And what's really interesting is in the last several years, I've been noticing an uptick of the number of highbrow art sculptures that are of human forms, which for some time hasn't been that way, but they all have an interesting twist to them, whether it's what material they're made out of, or some other element. I've got, I think, 5 examples to show. Each one of them has its own interesting quirk. And what I'm seeing in all of these is there is a yearning for that realism and romanticism, but there's got to be some kind of quirk, some kind of gimmick that allows it past those highbrow gatekeepers. There's some element to all of these arts that has some kind of a touch, that some sort of perforation of the sense of life that doesn't let you go all the way to romantic realism. So I'm going to let you drive the share screen here, Rob. We have them all in order. Do we have them in order?
Hold on, I'm finding it. They're all in order somewhere. Oh, I see it. It's the Zoom post. There we go.
All right. No, not this one.
Not this one, no. It's
Okay.
like this one.
So this is, and I'm not actually sure how tall this one is, but we are getting a human form. There's two interesting things about this one. First of all, the back of the skull, as you can see, is sort of dissolved. You can all see this, right? Yeah, people can see. Okay, so the back of the skull is almost dissolving. This is an article about this sculptor, but what he's doing is he's using a bunch of really interesting materials. This particular sculpture is made out of bike chains. So scroll down, Rob, we'll show a couple of the others. Here's another where you can actually see the bike chains a little bit more carefully. And then this last one. Okay, now here you can see them up close. So he's taking an unusual material, which, I mean, it's totally amazing to me that you could take a bike chain and make it this pliable, make it form like this. But there's an element to this that is letting him through the gates. And it's this quote here: bodies are intended to question the industrialization of labor. So, and we can see a couple, you want to see a couple more? So then sometimes he'll show you the human form, but then like the entire face is missing. This one is this one's not made out of bike chains. This just made out of chains. And when we see this one up close, it looks kind of really cool on the hands, but you're gonna have to scroll way down to get to the face.
Get a little farther, get it, there we go. Sorry. Okay, a few more of these examples. I know which one.
Yeah,
I know which one. It's a long thing, but I know which one you're looking for. I gotta get to.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay. So I am personally really disturbed by this because this looks like worms to me. But so again, I am flabbergasted that somebody can make a chain. This is just chain you can pick up at the hardware store. I know the very chain. I am amazed that somebody can make this. But again, he's getting through that gate because of this level, this little perforation of seeing the human form, but in a non-heroic material. Now, this one is another, these are not human forms, but spectacular sculptures of animals. These are all made out of chicken wire. And if
oddly, none of them are chickens.
No, there aren't any chickens. But look at the musculature of these animals. We can scroll down and show you a few more. These are monkeys. Look at the detail of the shape, the way the body moves. They're focusing on the reality. This one's really funny. This is in somebody's staircase, or maybe it's a museum.
Yeah.
There's the lion. You can see all the musculature, the way that the body rests on the paws. Right at the front leg here above the shoulder, there's almost a round knobby muscle. That's part of a lion. But these are made out of chicken wire. This next one, this is a video before you play. This is an interesting series of, this is just one sculpture, but this is one of the types of things this particular artist does. Do you need to make it full screen or can they see it?
I'll do full screen.
Okay. All right, and then so take a look as you walk by this art, what happens to the human form? The human disappears.
And it comes back again.
So isn't that an interesting statement psychologically?
Oops.
Sense of life.
Okay, we're gonna go out of.
You need to hit escape.
Yeah, I didn't realize it was gonna end on me there.
All right, and then here's another. This one's a paint. Oh, I said I was doing all sculpture. This one's a painting.
I'm still back on this one. There we go.
Can you full screen first?
This one does not. Yeah, I can actually.
Okay, now watch what happens when you walk by this particular painting. As you go from side to side, the portrait ages. Isn't that amazing? That one, first of all, that somebody, you want to replay that one just so they could see that twice, because this is just phenomenal that somebody is capable of doing this. That as you smoothly walk from side to side, this portrait ages before your very eyes. So smoothly that you can barely, I mean, I can't see where it happens. And then, no, you can stop share. Okay, so this is the kind of stuff that we're starting to see that used to be in the niche market is now starting to percolate up into that what's considered highbrow market. It's happening because I think everybody is yearning for it, as Ayn Rand has talked about through all these chapters we've read. But I think it's really fascinating. We can watch there. This is one of the lines that she has from this, from the first page of this chapter, Bootleg Romanticism. She talks about that art, a society's art, is revealing its naked subconscious. And I think that we can watch the trends that are starting to happen and see how each individual of those three markets is responding and finding that much needed way of supplying art for the culture. And it's interesting that we're having this beginning of extraordinary focus on humans and the human condition at that high level of art, but with some interesting twist to it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Sherri. So what we'll do is I will take maybe 2 questions for the, of the panelists for the panel, and then we'll go directly into the breakout rooms. Folks, this time we're talking about not only this meetup, but you can talk in breakout rooms about any other question on anything that we have discussed in this series. And then when we come back, you get to talk about your takeaways, and you can put a question on the table, and which we'll go ahead and answer. So does anybody have, Joia, you had a burning question, I think. In your presentation, you were asking people something.
Just to reiterate, I'm curious what people think about the status still of romanticism in our age, and what the works that, and I really want to thank Sherri and Rob, because this even, they brought so many concrete examples to the table for us to even think about, to help us answer this question. And to get back to what I think is Ayn Rand's concern, that there's something important in romanticism that is somehow not allowed fully in our culture.
Let me ask one question, and then I mean, when I think about the thrillers, for example, I find I think Joia, you talked about it. You said that there is a lot of escapism. Like, it's kind of trying to access the system, which is aspirational, but it gives a feeling that you have actually exercised it without actually exercising it. So it's a kind of a substitute for a genuine aspiration, which a great romantic art would give you. And in that sense, it's an escapism, because it's kind of, you feel that you are kind of feeling a certain way, but it has nowhere to go. It's almost like a feeling which is an end in itself. It just stops there, and it doesn't really carry over into rest of the art. So to what extent is this bootleg romanticism about escapism, as opposed to not a full attempt at achieving what a romantic art does?
You want to answer that?
Oh,
I think that for some, I think you have to look at the individual examples. I agree with Joia that as from number 1 to number 24 of James Bond, they tend to be more that way. And sometimes today, television shows that have hero are often they're often called escapist television shows, like Burn Notice.
Yeah.
And some of that I think is actual escapism. Some of it is that's the negative label that the highbrow culture is giving to it, and then sometimes it's really not. But some of it seems like escapism if it's not of this world, but I think it really is romanticism and hero involved. For example, the Harry Potter series.
Well, can I do something on that? Because that's
Oh.
something I want to talk about. Because
He's
Harry
pulling
Potter,
my card.
well, no, Harry Potter is a great example, now that you mentioned it, because there was this thing that happened about 5 years ago. It was like around the time Trump got elected. There's this thing that happened in politics where suddenly there was this giant rash of people using Harry Potter references to explain politics, or it was this cascade of Harry Potter references going into supposedly serious writing on politics. And the reason for it was very clear, which is that you had a bunch of people in the media business who were just the right age range that they had grown up with the Harry Potter books, right? Because I'm too old for the Harry Potter books to have been. It's something I discovered with my kids, not when I was a kid. But the people who were in their teens in the 1990s when these and the early 2000s when these books came out, who then 10, 15 years later they're writing for political magazines and newspapers, and so you got this flood of Harry Potter references. And so much so that it became sort of a trope on Twitter, especially, to say, read another book. There are other books to refer to when making political analogies. But I find that interesting. I find that fascinating from the perspective of bootleg romanticism, because I think what was happening is you had a whole bunch of people who were looking for a moral language. And maybe this is almost tipping over into next week's discussion in the next chapter. But there are people who are looking for a moral language to explain the issues that they're trying to deal with. And they were looking to art from that. And where the only place they had gotten it in art was when they were kids reading Harry Potter, right? They didn't have other things that they had encountered afterwards that were giving them, maybe more serious and substantive examples. So I think that's a great example of the sort of the escapist thing that you're talking about, that when people need these moral concepts to refer back to, and they get them from art, and art helps them keep those moral concepts concretized and make them usable in their lives. But if they're not getting that from a lot of the other sort of high culture, they get it from, well, there's these books that were really popular when I was 12 years old. So it's a perfect example of how that is limiting. And if your only way of dealing with Donald Trump, something like Donald Trump just got elected in 2016, if your only way of dealing with that is, well, let's see, what did I read about Voldemort?
Malfoy.
Yeah, Malfoy or Voldemort or something. These characters from Harry Potter. That's your only framework for going back and dealing with it, because the art has been escapist, because it has not been based on and connected to real life.
Sorry. I had something I want to say, but Maritza, you can go first.
Oh, okay. I was going to jump in and say that, she can't, I think also the concept of escapism and not being quite sure which literary pieces fall under that banner are kind of a glimpse into the state of our current culture. Like Ayn Rand in this chapter tells us that art is the barometer for our culture. And I do see that more and more it is very hard to make that determination. Is what we're reading escapism, or is there actually some moral dilemma that I'm looking at, that I'm being tantalized with and asked to ponder? And I think that that shines a spotlight on this need for more, things that have a little bit more hair, as it were, for us to hold on to.
I wanted to respond and tie this back to something, Shrikant, that you said, I forget in which session earlier, about this idea of humility and ambitiousness. And we need sort of both of these qualities together. And in my mind, that's a perfect description of what you ought to get from reading a real work of Romanticism with heroes, that it should inspire both humility and ambitiousness. Humility that, there's this vision of the hero who is beyond where I'm currently at, but I could be open and learn from this. And then combine that with your own personal sense of ambitiousness to then take that vision and go make something grand with your life. And I think that, to my mind, that's even what's missing in these escapist works. When you're saying that they just sort of end, that's what's missing. That I think when people, for example, read the James Bond books or see the movies nowadays, that's it, that they go and have this experience in the theater, but they don't get out of it neither humility or ambitiousness to go make something grand with our lives. Maybe we'll talk about this next time, but to me, the Harry Potter books and perhaps even the fantasy genre is very interesting because I see it as straddling this line, because I think the best fantasy works are saying really important things about reality, and that you can read them in a way where you actually gain valuable lessons that you then really can apply in your life. And not to make this about politics, but it's been interesting to me to even see that in recent years now, we've seen the author, J.K. Rowling, get attacked by various Twitter mobs, and whatever you might think about that situation, just the ability for her to stand up against the mob. One of the first thoughts that came to my mind was, and this was the person who wrote Harry Potter, the person who could write a book about a character that could stand up in face of opposition, could be the person who could in real life stand up against a mob. But the interesting thing about the fantasy genre is that there's sort of the realistic elements and then the fantasy elements. And so how much of it is a reader or somebody watching the movies just getting involved in the escapist fantasy where it never does go anywhere, versus seeing something that is real in a hero that they can actually then, take the sense of ambitiousness and apply it to their real lives.
Excellent. So folks, we'll have plenty of time for questions after the breakout rooms. The purpose of the breakout rooms, doing the breakout rooms before the questions, is that you get to vet your questions, ask your questions in the breakout rooms, and only the questions that you're carrying away from that after a great conversation with other folks, you bring it up. So you can come back with takeaways and questions, and they can be on either this or any other topic that we have dealt with in this series. I'm starting the breakout rooms now. They will run for 20 minutes, and then we'll be back here automatically. Come back, folks. So it's time for takeaways and questions. So you can, again, the rules remain the same. So what we're doing this time is we're doing the Q&A now. So you get to talk about 1 to 1.5 minutes about your takeaways, and then you can ask a question. You can just do takeaway, you can just do questions, or you can do both, okay? We have 4 rules as usual. Type exclamation mark to speak. Number 2, keep on topic. And topic this time is everything that we have covered in Romantic Manifesto, any of the meetups, okay? Number 3, be brief. And number 4, feel free to speak your mind, disagree with anybody on anything, and do so courteously. All right, who would like to go first? Go ahead and type an exclamation mark. And then I'm going to call on Jonathan at some point to see what questions he has collected. He's our questions guy. Lloyd, go ahead.
Yes, I was just going to say, again, I mean, this may be just me, or some people could relate to this, but I don't think in my life I've really been that inspired by fictional characters. I think, well, James Bond would do this, so I'll do that. I just find for myself real people, real flesh and blood, is more inspiring. I think fiction, I can see what you're saying, but I think it's secondary. I think more important is real figures, real people like Abraham Lincoln. I'm taking a class on Winston Churchill right now. A very inspiring guy. I mean, not right all the time, but right about when it really counted, World War II. And I think that thirst for real people may be what allows demagogues, dictators to get such attraction, because they are real. They are flesh and blood. So, I mean, characters that aren't real, I think they're secondary. I think a better use of your time, if you want to be inspired, is to study real history. Real great leaders and great characters, Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, FDR. You know, you could add to your list. You might have different people, but I think real history is very instructive. And I don't think you're limited by just that's what it was. You could easily take the example of Abraham Lincoln in trying to hold the country together, or you could take a Winston Churchill in inspiring his people. His speeches are fantastic. I mean, Winston Churchill, Martin Luther King, his speeches, but these are real people. These aren't made up characters.
Okay. Thank you, Lloyd. So panelists, you're welcome to respond to any takeaways, to answer any questions as and when people speak. Rob.
Well, Lloyd touches on one of my favorite things to rail against, which is when Hollywood makes movies based on real people, on real history. And like 80% of the time, what they come up with is not only flagrantly inaccurate, but actually less interesting than the real person and the real history of the thing that happened. Like Aaron Sorkin does a thing on Steve Jobs and manages to miss everything that's interesting about Steve Jobs as a businessman, right? It's all about, well, how did he feel about his daughter? It's like, well, we don't care what he felt about his daughter. How did he bring the mouse? How did he do all these different, how did he take all these innovations and make them, available? And there's all these fascinating stories that don't get included in there. So yeah, I'm definitely that historical figures are, and drawing inspiration from history is hugely powerful. But that also, how do you know about history? Well, how do you know about history is partly sometimes through art. And when they don't get it wrong, in the breakout room, Sherri and I are just talking about that we have 2 sculptures that we own that are kept in, well, when our office is built up properly, we'll be in the office or in the living room right now. Mine is Udon's a plaster copy of Udon's bust of Thomas Jefferson, and hers is a sculpture done about 20 years ago of Michelangelo. We'll show it to them, you guys, to them sometime. It's really good. But this is our way of having historical figures, real people, but as represented by an artist to serve as a reminder and inspiration.
And I want to second what you were talking about, Lloyd, that history is full of amazing stories. Our children are so soaked in it around here. It's hilarious. But that's another realm of not literature, nonfiction that has really been taken hold of in the last several decades. There is a really wonderful amount of really fantastic stories that are based on serious historical research, like the Hidden Figures. I'm sure you've all read, if you've seen the movie, go read the book.
Which is better.
Which is way better, because it tells you not just it doesn't just focus on one woman. In that particular movie kind of focuses on Katherine Jenkins, but the book really delves deeply into the stories of everyone that was involved in that, of the people that were the small hand up, the small correction of the racism that was happening at the time. And it shows exactly how much you can be a hero in just a small act of kindness. And so these kinds of books are very popular, and there's an awful lot of them out there and just about every topic you can think of. It's a wonderful place to find heroism.
Wonderful. Next is going to be Maritza, but folks, the format here is that you go ahead and say your takeaway and put your questions on the table, and then participants will respond to it, and then we'll just go to the next person. So there's no back and forth because we want to cover as much ground as possible. Maritza.
I just want to say really quickly is that, again, I agree with you, Lloyd. You make fantastic points, and the historical figures, it's definitely a ground that needs to be how do you say, recommended, especially to our youth. But I don't believe that saying that takes away from some of the statements that Ayn Rand is saying in this book, because she does, in the very beginning, she does express to us that, this is not the only platform for finding, morality, as it were. She's saying that, art gives you more of a direct idea for a moral sense of life. And I think that that's a slight distinction from looking at historical figures as ideals from the perspective of morality, if that makes sense. The distinction that she's making is that one.
So I also agree that it's tremendously, I personally find historical figures to be tremendously valuable. I wouldn't even think in terms of historical figures. It's really people, like, individuals achieve something in their own character, and they actually achieve it, and you can see it, and you can be inspired by it, and you can learn from it. People like Leonardo or Louis Sullivan, for me, have served that purpose of saying, okay, what is possible? And an artist, their job is to take in people like that and produce something better, something which is higher than that. That is the minimum requirement of an artist. And surprisingly, some artists actually pull it off. You look at characters of Victor Hugo, they are able to do that. You look at, Cyrano de Bergerac, or, but it's not just, the other point I want to make is that different people react differently to different art. So for some people, literature may not do enough. For them, maybe visual art does the same thing. For many people, music does some things. Music does some things where there is no equivalent that they can find anywhere else. So you should look for inspiration wherever you can find it. And it's all kind of human creativity, either in actual creation. As Ayn Rand says, man is a being of self-made soul. So you can get direct inspiration from there, or you can get inspiration from art. Next up, it's going to be Dave, Alex, Les, and Rupali. Dave.
Thanks, Rikant, and thanks for a good panel, for a great presentation. And especially thanks to Sherri for holding art class and bringing forth those images. I wanted to comment on the man's skull made of chains. To me, the medium is sometimes a comment more than just the image. For that example, we feel imprisoned. I have to go to work every day. It reminded me a long time ago, there was a picture of I think a African-American actor with golden chains around his neck, not chain mail, but the same size industrial chains, but painted gold, to symbolize, he'd been released from slavery. And it reminded me also, back in Wichita, Kansas, in the plaza outside of the bank downtown, was a horse figure, a little larger than life size, made out of car bumpers, which it's just so funny. But then I just realized today, that the car replaced the horse. So a commentary that way. But anyway, thanks very much again. Have a good day.
Thank you, Dave.
Yes, that's very true. That the material that you're using is definitely, absolutely part of the message that these artists are trying to get across. The bicycle chain doesn't feel so much to me like you're chained in yourself, but the one with actual chain maybe feels that way more to me. The bicycle chain, because it's more mechanical, more made, it feels more like he's trying to say something about the quote from industrialization. But the car bumpers as the horse I've always really been amused by that one, replacing the horse.
Oh, yes.
Next up is going to be Alex, Les, and Rupali. Alex, go ahead. Folks, go ahead and line up for sharing your takeaways or questions, and you can bring up any question or any takeaway from the entire series at this point. Alex.
I feel that during the breakout room, I had this question regarding whether or not Ayn Rand really has the definitive, definition of romanticism in art, because I understand she's not an artist herself. She's a writer, and from the art world to the literature world, I personally feel it's very different. So for her to not being an artist and kind of trying to dictate what romanticism is a little bit, I'm not questioning her, but I have a little bit of a not very sure sometimes exactly what she's referring to. Is it literature or is it movies, like in this chapter? And then I'm so sorry, I just want to say something that I feel like her idea of romanticism, or romanticism in general, accordingly to her definition, I think contrary, to what Lloyd was saying before, that I think it only exists in a fictional world, because heroes in real life, the so-called heroes that we call them in real life, are full of faults, full of them. You look at any single one of the Napoleons, or and so that perfect hero kind of prototype, I feel that only exists in literature or art, because in that fantasy, then you don't have these faults. And then the second thing is, there's so many different types of art now, and what I'm talking about is the function of art, which inspires virtue. So it doesn't matter what you look at, is a abstract painting, abstract installation, or a beautiful portrait. I think as long as the function of the goal of what Ayn Rand is saying is that inspires virtue and morality, and that inspires you in your daily life to do something, that that would be a success. Yeah.
Thank you, Alex. Who would like to respond?
I think Maritza wants to respond.
Maritza, go ahead.
Yes, I do. I have to say, I'm so hurt to hear that somebody doesn't think a writer is an artist. I'm wounded to the very, very deepest part of my heart. I believe emphatically that a writer is an artist, and I must very orneryly tell you that there's nothing you can say to make me think differently. So that's how I'm starting this. So I believe that an artist can be an architecture. I walk through Center City, Philadelphia, with my head looking up in awe of the beautiful art that I see as I'm walking down the street, because Philadelphia has these amazingly beautiful architectural buildings still. You have to look up though, above the first floor, right? And so I don't think that art is just one thing. Now, I know almost nothing about any of the sculptures that Sherri is introducing to us here today, and I would never claim to be very well versed on literal artwork in general, but I read a massive amount of different types of fictional works and literature and poems, and that's art to me. It's all art. And yes, I agree with you that maybe fiction is the one place where you will find the ideal to which Ayn Rand alludes. But she does say, and I have listened to just about every interview I can find on Ayn Rand. So what I can tell you is that by her own words, she's been asked, well, why don't you make Howard work more approachable? Why is he never going to get a cup of coffee? Why doesn't he ever get a code? And she says, because when we are providing a picture of the ideal, we only include that which is necessary and important. Yes, everybody stops sometimes to get coffee and everybody gets sick, but that's not really, when somebody's telling the life of Maritza, I would hope that they, leave out the parts where I had to go to the bathroom, because that's not important. It's not that it doesn't happen, but that's not important to the story. Even when you're thinking of fiction, when you read the massive work, when you read Hamilton, they don't talk about Hamilton going to the bathroom or getting a code, unless it's a part that is integral to the history, the story of him and his greatness. So that's what she says. That's why her ideals, or she views ideals in fiction not to have these flaws, because it's not that the flaws don't exist. Remember that art is showing you what might be and what ought to be. And because it's doing that, it's not necessary to point out flaws, because flaws already exist. And that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
And I wanted to, I knew Maritza was gonna, I could just see it in her face. I have to agree. Artists come in on all as individual, and their mediums are as individual as all of us humans are. So literature is just another form of it. And I just wanted to second that. Everything else I agree with too.
And I just wanted to add one other thing, formation, which is that we talked a lot earlier in the earlier chapters about the concept of important, that art shows you what's important. And so when you look at a historical figure, for example, who has certain flaws, the question is, what's important about that person? What was important is what he accomplished, or what was important was that he was flawed. So that's, I think, is sort of part of the idea of why the point of art is specifically to take something, a real person who existed as inspiration, and then to take out the parts of him that were flawed and emphasize the parts that were good, in order to sort of promote and inspire you to emulate the parts that are good.
Wonderful. Thank you. Maritza, you did a fantastic job. I was going to say exactly that, but you did a fantastic job. Next up is Les.
Can I say one thing of what they said? Is that possible, or am I not doing it right?
Jade, I'll put you in line. So it's going to be Les, Rupali, Madeline, and Jade. Okay, Les first.
Yeah, hi. It's just building on what Rob said. I think that the key word there, important, is very important. And it kind of gets to my takeaway here in this chapter, which I think is really fundamental when it comes to looking at, the lesser lights of the romantic literature, or the romanticism in terms of the thrillers. And one key paragraph that I picked up out of this chapter was, she mentions here when she's talking about thrillers and what they are. She says, thrillers are a simplified, elementary version of romantic literature. They are not concerned with delineation of values, but taking certain fundamental values for granted. They are concerned with only one aspect of a moral being's existence: the battle of good against evil in terms of purposeful action, a dramatized abstraction of the basic pattern of choice, goal, conflict, danger, struggle, victory. Victory, that's the word I underlined, was victory at the end. And I think that kind of captures the whole essence of this in terms of giving us an uplated feeling that we're able to see this actually happen, whether it's in fiction or literature, anywhere, and be able to take those same concepts. And unlike Joia, I can see, confronting the flaws, making the hard decision when it's in a real struggle. I see those that abstraction present, and that I can apply it to so many concrete situations. But it comes down to what I thought when I saw that word victory. I think that's the whole purpose of this whole book when it comes to Romanticism. Is you can succeed, you can be successful, you can overcome, you can do anything you want to put your mind to, as long as you got harmony between your philosophy and your sense of life, subconsciously held. If you can marry those two together, you've got things under control. But this gets me to the one question that I have. And I'm hoping that it kind of gets back to sculpture, but it goes right back to the very beginning of the whole book. And that's the title page of the book, the cover page, I should say. And it's got the wings of victory. And of course, when I saw that victory in that last paragraph, I said, yeah, that goes back to the title page with the, that sculpture back in the 2nd century BC, the wings of victory. And that brings me to my question. And that's on the 2nd edition, she's changed the cover on the 2nd edition from the 1st edition. The 1st edition has 2 wings. The 2nd edition has only 1 wing. The 2nd edition is mainly includes the chapter on art and cognition. In my mind, she's saying that this book is not really an original until you put in the art cognition aspect of the Romanticism. So my question here is on this. I look at that on it when I look at the wing there. I'm only seeing the original left wing on the presentation and no wing on the right-hand side. Do you think that's indicative of anything of saying that this is really the original? Because I understand the right wing must have been damaged and it was added in the Louvre, to complete it, as far as where it sits in I think it's in the Louvre. So that's my question.
Just
a comment.
Yeah, I just want to have one quick answer on that, which is as someone in the publishing industry, as a writer, I can tell you that the author generally has no control whatsoever about what the cover of the book looks like. And this book actually has gone through a whole number of different covers. So for example, if we're going to hold that up, this is when I came up and got this is one of my old copies. This was Icarus. Robert Heindel was the artist who did, I think, an objectivist or Ayn Rand influenced artist who did the covers in this that were around in like the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So they've gone through a whole bunch of different variations over the years, and up to the new one, which is the pink winged victory of Samothrace, and why it's pink, I have no idea. But no, the artist usually has no control over that. There's no intended message there.
Okay, next up is going to be Rupali, Jade, and Jeff. Rupali.
Thank you, Shrikant and Rob, Sherri, Maritza, and Joia. Fantastic presentation again today. I wanted to say a little bit about what we discussed earlier about historical figures and fictional figures. Both are important. Learning and being inspired by both historical figures and fictional figures as possible. But what Ayn Rand talks about, I think earlier in her book, is history is what it is, and these the people are, they're humans, and they haven't yet achieved that highest ideal. And yes, they've done a lot and they've achieved a lot in their lives, but they are at the end of the day humans with flaws, which then you can pick on those flaws. As Rob mentioned, you can leave out all the great things that these people did and just focus on their flaws. Whereas what happens with fictional figures is that you're able to just focus on the virtues. You're able to focus on the achievements. You're able to take away from the fictional figures what life should be and ought to be. I think that having both historical figures and fictional figures is important to human development or to our cognition, I would say. That's my takeaway. Thank you.
I would also add that I think for especially for some artists, that part of the point of fiction is to create something that hasn't existed before. To say, if only you could have somebody like this, you know, these real life examples, but better. And here's my vision of how that would happen. I mean, I think that's kind of what what Ayn Rand did with Frank Lloyd Wright in some ways.
You mean with
Yeah, that Howard Rourke is sort of like, here's Frank Lloyd Wright, only better. Because, you know, if Frank Lloyd Wright in his own personal life had some weird aspects to him. But and actually, I'm stealing some of Sherri's thunder, but something we've talked about with regard to the Fountainhead is that Howard Rourke's architectural theory and his approach to architecture is not exactly any one existing architectural theory that had actually been put together with somebody. It was like Ayn Rand taking elements, all the best elements from a bunch of different modernist approaches to architecture, and almost creating a new synthesis that took out some of the elements she didn't like and put things back in a way that she did like. So it was her. I know I'm stealing your stuff again, but it was.
I don't even get to finish writing it before he steals it and spreads it everywhere.
But I think the point is that sometimes an artist, in creating a character or creating a figure, is basically saying, let's take the things that exist and let's put them into a new combination that might be better and then inspire people. This new combination that I'm creating might inspire people to bring that into reality.
All right, that's enough. That's enough.
Sherri, Rob has an advantage. He can do that, and he knows that you won't take his political stuff and try to talk about
You're right. You're so right.
It goes only one way.
It's a one-way road.
Okay. Next up is going to be Jade, followed by Jeff. Jade, go ahead.
I don't know. There's so much that's been said. I don't know how to cherry pick, but I think the most relevant comment that I kind of have is the fact that even in this discussion, we tend to look at people holistically or anything holistically. We either look at it for the flaws or the virtues. But if you look at someone holistically, you'll realize that, they usually balance themselves out. With the church group that I have discussions with, that one thing that kept coming up too with Jesus. It's like, people would look at him as, the person who sacrificed himself, or the person who hung out with the poor and the downtrodden. Like, nobody really considered him to be one person. They kind of compartmentalize him. And I think that's the problem, again, ideals, is that because we compartmentalize these people, these creators, these images so much, we kind of make them feel unattainable sometimes, is what I hear a lot in discussion. Most of those ideals are actually possible. I think a lot of the thing about ideals isn't necessarily that we don't see them going to the coffee shop, is that we don't understand all the steps that went into them becoming who they are. So I was in a lot of very intense environments, learning environments. And when I look at people like Beyonce, or when I look at Kobe Bryant, or anybody that's regarded really well, people just look at him on the court, her on stage. They don't look at the fact that they're probably about hundreds of people that have gone into making them look amazing. And that also gets taken out when we're reading. We don't understand the process that developed that individual into who they were. The fact that, there were people who were, yes, these people had their own drive, but like, there are people who make sure Beyonce looks good. There are people who, there's a team around these people who help them become these idealized individuals. So it's like, there's a lot that's missing when we have a conversation about things. And people brought up Hidden Figures, but a movie that really comes to mind is Black Panther. Because to me, one of the biggest takeaways is the reason why that place was, the takeaways we take away nowadays are very, I don't know what to say about them. Because it seems like we usually take away the thing that's the least, we don't bother looking for the moral of the story, especially with movies and a lot of things I find. Like we will walk away inspired, but we won't find the practical transferable skills or abilities, or sit there and go, well, how do I develop that in myself? We often, again, idealize that I can't be that because that's the ideal. There's a lot more that I want to say, but not to take up anything. I think we kind of use like an aspect of escapism that I'm now starting to try and figure out is that it actually allows us to escape moral responsibility because we create these ideals and we live in a society where we say ideals are not obtainable. You need to accept less than because ideals are not real. So it's kind of like we make them so that we don't have to achieve them. So we could just say, no, but look, that's so high up there. We can't be that.
Wow, that
That's
was
it.
amazing. Thank you, Jade. Really appreciate that. So let me respond, and then anybody else who wants to respond. So I really like what you're saying. See, what happens is that a lot goes into making human achievement possible. One part of it is projecting where you want to go, which can serve as a beacon. And then there is a lot of hard work, lot of struggle, lot of back and forth, lot of attempts at doing things, failures, sticking through that and making it happen. Now, there is an art, there is a kind of escapist art, which kind of shows you that, hey, this is the beacon, but actually it is not very real because there is no path leading to it. It's like they're showing you a shortcut, something. It's like sugar. Okay, here is sugar, it's going to give you a sugar high right now, but it's not going to, it actually is a substitute for nutrition. Okay, it is just going to appear to give you something. A great artist great artists actually provide some kind of a path. Now, not detailed path, because what happens is that human life has so much detail. It's impossible to communicate an ideal and a path to it in the fullest detail that a life has, because your life, my life is going to be different. So there are individual lives are going to be different as well. So it's impossible to give the details. And I don't think anything, art or even any speech or any nonfiction book can do justice to the full detail of human life, because individual life is enormously complex. But art at its best, what it can do is that it can give you a flow chart. It can show you a pattern, and it can show you not all of the pattern, but the pattern that matters, that actually takes you, not only gives you the motivation to go there, but some means as well. And because that is actually being demonstrated in the work itself. It takes a lot, and then you can't really take it. It's not like a passive thing. You kind of have to do a lot of work yourself to kind of almost reverse engineer that art in order to make it a part of you. So that's what I would have to say. But Robin, Sherri.
Yeah, I'm going to point out quickly, there is actually a whole genre or subgenre of romantic art. And in fact, I think, some of the stuff like Victor Hugo that Ayn Rand loved falls in this in a way, which is where the fundamental conflict is within the individual. Mm-hmm. The fundamental conflict is somebody's attempt to overcome an error or to improve themselves in some way or overcome their flaws. Now, a couple times back, we had a conversation with Joia about the Netflix series, The Queen's Gambit, and the question of whether it has a plot. So I finally finished it. We finally finished it. We got our internet was down for a while. We got it back up. We finished it. And it does have a plot. The only thing is that all the plot happens in episode 8. so I kept feeling like it seems like we're building up to something and then the plot doesn't really get going. And that's because they spend 7 episodes building on the buildup. And then all the plot happens in episode 8. And the plot is basically her overcoming her past and overcoming her problems in order to succeed at this one last thing. and
Spoilers.
not but it's a classic example of the plot where it's a romantic story, but where the plot is about the conflict being within the person, having to overcome their flaws and their problems in order to accomplish what they want to accomplish. So that is a whole subgenre of romantic literature.
Jade, you had something. Please go on. You're on mute still.
I think the thing is, a theme that's been going through my head for a while is the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I think even with art, it has people, let's say movies, because that's what keeps coming to me. You leave the theater, you leave the gallery, fully inspired and well-intentioned. But intention versus action versus actual impact. So we'll do a lot of well-intentioned things, but again, when you're focused on an ideal, you're focused on a shell of something. You don't, you're not figuring out what the meat and potatoes, the essence, and the real part of that thing that actually made the impact. So it's just like someone who's okay, let's use romance as an example. Like a woman who feels like she has to have a picture perfect wedding in order to have a great marriage. And it's like, maybe some people, the marriage, the picture perfect wedding brings, it's part of the story, but is that the reason why these people had this picture perfect marriage? And I think we tend to just look at the elements that were there, but we're not very good at analyzing it necessarily and saying, these are the elements of those elements that brought about this result. And so we end up with all these good intentions, but not any real impact. And so we end up walking around feeling impotent, because we kind of are, because we keep doing things, but not doing what we want or having the results we want. And then we end up going back to the concept of these are unobtainable ideals.
Thank you. Thank you, Jed. Anybody wants to comment on the Maritza?
Just really quickly, Jade, I think you give people far more credit than I would, but I think, well, the only reason I'm saying that, and I don't mean that as a rebuke in either anyway, I do have to admit that I don't really go to the movies, so I can't remember the last time I was at a theater, and that wasn't an independent film, so I have almost zero knowledge of that experience. But I will say that I find, and I think, and you're so in line with what Ayn Rand is trying to say to us in this book, that it's so exciting to hear you speak. I'm going to go on a tangent and say that. But I think a lot of people don't leave or don't finish watching a movie with that inspired feeling. And that's the problem. I think if we approached every movie as though we were seeking, what is the moral question here? What is this trying to teach me? If more people approached literature or movies in that fashion, maybe we would have less incidences of feeling that bereavement and lack of food for our soul, as it were, because that's what I hear you alluding to, that we're left floundering about looking for that thing that's going to feed us, and we're not finding it. But Ayn Rand says, don't despair, just keep looking at different types of things, you'll find it. But I think you make fantastic points, and it's very exciting because they sound so in line with this book. Thank you.
Thank you, Jade. Next up is Jeff. Jeff, go ahead.
So I want to pick up right there, Maritza, where you left off, and Jade, thank you so much for starting that aspect of the conversation. Just connecting, kind of the surreal sense of reality over the last year in so many dimensions, and looking at, the written and read to us words right in the inauguration from our young poet laureate, Amanda Gorman, who just really, stole the show. And her lines, when day comes and we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade, the loss we carry, a sea we must wade, and yet the dawn is ours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. Her words, I think they just carried all of us into a different place, even beyond the the inspiration and all the feelings, and in the midst of a continuing reality that feels surreal. And so you can just see in the response to her, right, both at that moment and then in the last 3 or 4 days, it's exactly what you're talking about. Looking to the written word, not only for the moral to the story, but for artistic inspiration. And I wonder if you have any comment on that.
Was that for me or for someone else?
No, for the panel.
For anybody who would like to join in. It just, I've now seen that performance 4 times and read the poem 3, and it actually, amazingly enough, it gets better with review rather than kind of, even when you know what's coming.
Thank you, Jeff. Okay, so I did not watch. I've not heard it yet, and I look forward to hearing it. But I think that's the power of poetry. That's what a poem can do, and if somebody can actually capture kind of a spirit of a moment, that's what art does. It gives kind of voice to what people are feeling. So that's wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Jonathan.
Wait, Rob had something here.
Oh, Rob, go ahead.
Unpopular opinion time. So this is my job. I'm the guy with the unpopular
nice.
opinion. I didn't care for the poem so much because I didn't think it was actually a poem. That is, it didn't, the poetic, it was lacking in poetic devices. I thought it was kind of an op-ed, sort of a dramatic reading of an op-ed. So I guess to the extent that it's inspiring, I want to have the credit go to the field of op-ed writing, my field, rather than to poetry. It was sort of like prose with some poetic elements to it, aspects to it. But I think the fact that people found some of those sentiments, I like the lines that you read, some of those sentiments very inspiring, I think shows the need that people have for this.
I think there is a continuity, right? I mean, there's speeches that actually move a nation. They have, that's where, Lloyd's point of kind of historical characters and art. And also for example, Rob and Sherri, both of you, like architecture is art, but writing is art too. In the sense that even when you're doing nonfiction writing, right? Or if you're writing a speech, if you can put that beacon up of saying, okay, this is what is possible beyond the level of what people think normally, and serve as a beacon, you are doing something similar to what an artist does. So
I just want to make sure on behalf of the speech writers and op-ed writers that we get credit for this.
All right.
Okay. Very good.
I'll mute us now.
Okay. So next up, I'm going to take questions from Jonathan and then Laura. Jonathan. Jonathan, we can't hear you.
I'll try again. Okay, there we go. Yeah, I was thinking about what Jade was saying, and what I was thinking, and I'm just putting this out there to hear other people's thoughts and comments, is you can go and look at an art piece, you can go and watch a movie and feel inspiration, but you're left with this feeling of like, what now? What do I do with this? And it can just fade in like, a month or two, and you're like, okay, great, that was a good experience, but so what? That's how I interpreted it. And it made me think of, maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I got. And it made me think of I guess you can't just have the meal, but you need the recipe as well. You need like an instruction. Okay, here I've got there's this amazing piece that I've looked at, but like, yeah, what now? And so I was curious if, I guess that's what you meant, and then comments on that.
Yeah. So let's go ahead. Okay, I don't have this. Give me a second. Okay. Does anybody want to comment on it? I do have comments on it. I think the function of art is different. So there are a couple of points I would make. First, this is specifically a reason why I regard. Maritza, why are you laughing? Okay. All right.
I apologize. It was an aside. It's Rob's fault.
Okay. All right. Okay. Oh, okay. Okay. All right. So guys, behave. All right. See, this is the reason why I think that participatory sports is better than spectator sport. And similarly, participatory art is far more powerful than spectator art. I think we should all be making art to express the deepest things that we have, because it combines both where you're going and how you're going. If you can actually produce something like that, you have some of the elements that will get you there. So that's one thing. The second thing is that art, when you consume art, it's not going to do everything for you. I mean, one of the functions of art is that it is a shortcut. Like at its best, you can see that very clearly in music. You just listen to music and you feel something, or you see a sculpture and you feel something. It's a shortcut. In order to actually feel like that about your life, that requires enormous amount of work to get there. And what art can do is that they can just give you the inspiration, show that there is that, it's like a person standing on the top of a hill in the middle of a cloud, but lighted by sunlight. You know that that is possible, but you have to climb it yourself. So art is not a substitute for working. Okay, who would like to go next?
I'm next. It's my turn.
Oh, I wanted to first see if the attendees wanted to the panelists wanted to respond to it any further. Okay, go ahead, Laura.
I have a bunch of things that have accumulated since this started. One thing I'd like to say about art, I think, and relative to some of the talk, abstract painting or abstraction, as I was to learn, was really just that you see everything in terms of a line, in terms of geometry, in terms of motion, and you don't see object, you only see the line of the object. So I don't know how that translates into what you were talking about in terms of romanticism and so forth. But that is, as I understand it, is true abstract. It took me a long time to get there. I painted like a year and a half without being able to do it, in part because my mother was dying and the painting I did after her death, I absolutely exploded. And I did my first abstract painting. Everything that was in me for that year and a half came out that painting. And the artist that was critiquing us came around and he looked at my painting and he said, wow. He said, you finally understand what abstraction is. It was a eureka moment. And it's a very emotional painting. It's always the one that's been up in my back spot. And everybody loves that painting. Everybody wants that painting. And of course, I'll never give up that painting because they all see this kind of emotionalism in the painting, in the movement, in the color. And I think I'd like to talk to you guys more about abstract painting and so forth. And the other thing I think that goes with some of it, people who are not familiar with abstract art, their first response is, I don't know, what is it? And I don't paint with intentionality, and I don't paint anything with any realistic thing. And I always just tell them, just look at it and see if you can see anything. And when you do that, they open up their minds and they start to say things, oh, I see this, I see this. And before they walk away, they see so many things. I don't see those things. So I see, all of a sudden, I see a whole host of things that I didn't see, and I add them to what I saw. So I think looking at abstract art is an incredible way of opening up, you know, one's vision. And I'd like to, again, talk about that with you guys. One more thing, the guy who irons that funny fabric, that tool, why don't you use a travel iron since you only use the tip of the iron instead of that big old iron? And I think I had one more thing, but
okay. Thank you.
Oh yeah, Frank Lloyd Wright, and why she was trying to destroy his life. I don't know why Ayn Rand was trying to destroy him. I'd like to talk about that sometime. I'm done.
Okay, I have no idea, Laura, what you said in the at the back. So I have no idea about destroying the life. I don't think there is anything to that. But anyway, let's see.
So I wanted to talk about the abstraction. So
It's something we were talking about in the car earlier.
I don't know if I'm thinking of the same thing you're thinking of. Anyway, let's go with what I've got. Which is when we did a thing on the progression from impressionism to abstract. It was the last time, and one of the things about the impressionists were doing is that, you know, with the way they used the brushstrokes and everything, it was you were painting not just the thing that you were painting your feelings about the thing. And the process basically from impressionism to abstraction is you focus more and more on the brushstroke showing your feelings and your reactions to the thing, to where you get to the point with what's called abstract expressionism, where you're just painting your feelings about the thing and not painting the thing itself. And the limitation of that is going to be exactly what you just described, which is that because you're not showing the thing, because there's not that actual object there that people can react to, their reactions become kind of subjective, which is, well, you know, whatever they bring to it that they want to impute into the thing, they can bring into it. But what you're communicating is not tied down to an object about which you can have a common understanding. Now, the other aspect of that, and I think this is the thing we're talking about, is that we noticed that the role of figurative art in recent times has kind of been taken over by photography. And so when you look at kids, you know, like people are fascinated with other people. And there's a reason why we're fascinated with people, which is we are people. You know, we deal with other people. We want to know what humanity is, right? It's deeply important to us to know what human life is, what human beings are, how they should act, what they can be like, because we are human beings. We need to know this. And so people are fascinated with other people, with looking at other people. And you can see that when art went abstract, a lot of the fascination of that, I think, goes to photography. And specifically, you know, you can go online and there's just reams and reams and reams of photographs of celebrities and actors and musicians, things like that. And one of the big things I noticed about that, and you know, you look at Hollywood celebrities, is a lot of them are kind of, well, I hate to put it, they're freaks. They are people with very unusual features. Like if you look at Julia Roberts and Eric Roberts, right? They're brother and sister, they're both actors. They are people with very exaggerated and unusual figures. So you saw something like that in real life, you think, my God, you know, how did you get that way? They're genetic anomalies in a way, that they have these very exaggerated features that they are in real life, by whatever genetic heritage they had or whatever genetic mixture they got from their parents. They are in real life the kind of exaggerated and essentialized form of a human being that an artist might create. You should look at pictures of Eric Roberts from early on. He's this tremendous craggy forehead and cheekbones, you know, very exaggerated features. Same thing for Julia Roberts, very, you know, incredibly, probably wide mouth and probably big eyes. So these are people who are, it's almost like photography and this whole celebrity culture finds in real life people who have those exaggerated characteristics that an artist might create in a work of art. But I think it shows that whatever, that there is a need that people have to see objects in real life, to see human beings, to see those objects presented, and to find meaning in that, because we're human beings. We live in a world of human beings. We want to know about our nature and what's possible to us. So that there's a tremendous underground need, which abstraction can't really serve, of seeing the human being and the real life of human beings presented.
And then others will see the abstract painting as not a limitation, but a greater freedom, because they can paint what they're painting, and without some element of reality, others can come to it and put their own reality or their own emotion or their own reaction to the painting, or maybe it's sculpture. They can bring their own, but that is getting back to the very thing we've talked about from chapter 1, which is the artist puts their ideas into the work, and the viewer or the reader puts it shows their own sense of life in their reaction to it.
Wonderful. All right. So let's see. What is coming up next? Moral treason, right? Art and moral treason.
And it really, so this came from a lecture, I guess she did, but a longer presentation that was about art and education. And I think that really is a huge part of what we want to explore next time too, the connection of art with morality and with education.
Okay.